let's say it's cold, and the homes are using more natural gas than usual, and power plants can't get it, that weather issue is not going to stop at the utility boundary. Weather systems usually cover several states. And so what you have is you're going to borrow from someone who's having the same problems. That's what I call the fatal trifecta, where your renewables aren't working for you, your natural gas isn't available to you because it's being used at homes or because maybe there's a pipeline freezing or something like that, or that sometimes water gets in and it isn't able to pump as well.
Welcome back, listeners. Today, we're diving into one of the least understood yet most consequential systems in modern life, the electric grid. And we're doing it with someone who has spent a career inside the machinery of how power gets made, moved, paid for, and governed. Our guest is Meredith Angwin, chemist, author, and one of the most experienced energy analysts in North America. Meredith has led pollution reduction and reliability projects at EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, worked across nuclear, geothermal, and gas-fired systems, and served on the coordinating committee for ISO New England's Consumer Liaison Group. Her latest book, Shorting the Grid, breaks down why the system we all depend on is far more fragile and more complex than most people ever realize. In this conversation, Meredith traces her journey from geochemistry to grid governance, and then pulls back the curtain on some of the realities most people never see. Why natural gas plants can struggle to get fuel when they need it most, why markets actually reward volatility, how subsidies and negative bidding distort pricing, and why she believes reliability requires more than wishful thinking about future technologies. It's an eye-opening look at the incentives, oversight, and decision-making that shape every electron that reaches our homes and businesses. Meredith, welcome. Excited to have you. As you know, we always like to start off with our guests by learning a little bit more about them. So what are you passionate about?
Well, I'm passionate about two things. I'm a mother and a grandmother, and I'm passionate about my family and their being healthy and things going well for them and anything I can do to make that happen. But as a professional or whatever, I'm a chemist, but I'm actually passionate about helping people understand reality. There's a lot of conversations out there about what we could do, what we should do, and so forth. And a lot of these conversations are not bounded in the reality of what this world is like. And so I always think that you can't make good decisions if you don't have a realistic view of what you're choosing amongst. So I guess I'm passionate about informing people, helping people, putting complicated reality stuff into simpler terms, and so forth. That's what I'm passionate about.
You then, through your career, have evolved to really become an expert in the grid as well. Can you share a little bit about kind of that journey?
Oh, yeah. Well, what happened is that being in nuclear, I began to be, I guess, passionate is the word, about keeping nuclear plants operating because they had such steady power and they didn't make any greenhouse gases. And it took me a couple of years, but not that long, to realize that nuclear was really something important for many grids. At any rate, one of the things about that was that when I sort of semi-retired and moved to Vermont, because my husband and son both had jobs nearby, and I was getting to the point where, that was what I wanted to do. So I moved here and I began writing a blog in favor of Vermont Yankee. And it was called Yes, Vermont Yankee. And I wrote that blog, and I wrote it because the local newspapers were very prejudiced against nuclear. I mean, I'm sorry to say it, but they were. They were not even-handed at all. I mean, nuclear could do nothing good, and renewables could do nothing bad. That's all it boiled down to. So I was trying to write that, to correct that slant by having information in my blog. So if the PUC in Vermont or Public Service Board in Vermont made some kind of ruling, I'd write about it in the blog. Or if somebody said, oh, the grid operators wants this and Vermont Yankee can do it or can't do it. So all of a sudden, if I was writing about Vermont Yankee, I couldn't just write about the plant itself. I ended up writing about its interaction with the various groups on the grid that ran the grid. So then there was a man who was on the board. Well, he wasn't on the board. It was the coordinating committee of the consumer liaison group of our grid operator. So he was on the coordinating committee of the consumer liaison group of a grid operator. And to my great surprise, he read my blog. Well, I mean, I was writing about the grid and stuff, so he was reading it. And he said, have you ever thought of joining the consumer liaison group of ISO New England? And my answer was, do they have a consumer liaison group? I had no idea. I mean, if there was some ruling that came down, I would track it down and I'd write a blog post about it and stuff. But I really didn't have, the whole thing is how does FERC and the PSB and how is ISO New England fit into all this. So at any rate, it turned out that I was elected actually by the other people there to be on the coordinating committee. And once I was on the coordinating committee, I began to understand how things worked, how power plants were paid, how power plants were dispatched, and all kinds of things that I had not really understood while my focus was just on Vermont Yankee. And so one of the things was that if somebody asked me why you're pro-nuclear, I could give them a fairly succinct answer. If they asked me something about the grid, I was like, oh, let me start with FERC. Then we're going to go on to, and so it was a very complex answer because the grid has multi-layers of governance, multi-layers of interlocking responsibility, which ends up being nobody being responsible because, who are you going to point at when there's 20 people responsible? So at any rate, that's how I ended up deciding I wrote some long blog posts about the grid, but after that I thought, if I don't write a book, people aren't going to read one lengthy blog post after another. So that's why I wrote a book called Shorting the Grid. It was a very hard book to write because my sources were mostly filings, legal filings and interviews at various levels of grid governance. And so, you could just go completely crazy.
And so, Meredith, you coined that term, the fatal trifecta. And that was describing the overdependence on renewables, just-in-time natural gas, and then having to rely on imports from other countries. Can you walk us through how those three factors figure into grid fragility? And
Yes. No, the thing is that what happens is that you have renewables. Now, solar and wind, everybody knows that we don't control the sun and we don't control the wind. They are available when they're available, and they're not available when they're not available. Now, many people think, oh, well, we're going to have batteries. Batteries are going to be very, very expensive. I don't want to even get into batteries because, a battery person will say, well, we can back up this much. And for how long? Oh, for an hour and a half, 2 hours? Okay, what if you've got a problem with the sun setting? It's going to be set for longer than 2 hours. It's going to be night. Anyway, so moving back with that, so I realized that what really happened, and this is from my work really with the Consumer Liaison Group, I realized that what really happened was that when renewables weren't available, then natural gas was called in. And natural gas is in many ways an excellent thing to call in because it's quick on and quick off. You can turn it on quickly, you can turn it off quickly. When cloud goes across the sun and you're counting on 30% solar, then you can turn on some natural gas, and it will make up for that. But the problem with natural gas is that it is delivered just in time. With very few exceptions, you don't have an LNG storage thing next to a power plant. The power plant has a line with a gas pipeline, and that's where it gets its gas, and it's just in time. It's delivered and used sort of simultaneously. Well, the thing about the delivered and used simultaneously is if anything interrupts the pipeline, then you've got a problem because you don't have natural gas. Now you say, well, why should things interrupt the pipeline? Of course, there are many things that could, but I'm going to just look at the most common reason that natural gas wouldn't get to a power plant would be that it's winter and the pipeline has only a certain capacity, and it is not just supplying the power plant, it's also supplying homes, and homes have priority. So it may be that the homes are using so much natural gas that the power plant can't get any or can't get as much as it wants. So then the power plant isn't making enough power to meet the demands on it. So the next thing that people do is they say, oh, well, luckily we have interconnects with neighboring systems. And so if we can't meet everything, we just ask them for some and we all cooperate and it's going to be great. And it sort of usually is, except for there are two factors about this. And one of them is that when there's an issue, a weather issue that's affecting how much natural gas goes to power plants because homes are using so much. Let's say it's cold and the homes are using more natural gas than usual and power plants can't get it. That weather issue is not going to stop at the utility boundary. Weather systems usually cover several states. And so what you have is you're going to borrow from someone who's having the same problems. That's what I call the fatal trifecta, where your renewables aren't working for you, your natural gas isn't available to you because it's being used at homes or because maybe there's a pipeline freezing or something like that, or that sometimes water gets in and it isn't able to pump as well. And then depending on the neighbors who aren't sharing, thank you, because they're every grid operator's first responsibility is to people on their grid. Can you imagine what you would say if somebody said, oh, we're going to have to black out your city for 5 hours here because we got to ship some power to a city upstate? Oh, no, you don't. Don't black out my city for somebody else's city. Thank you very much. So it's a big deal. I remember one of the times, National Electricity Responsibility Corporation, NERC, it had a winter reliability forecast. And this was many years ago. Well, it has it every year now. But when I remember being shocked that it said that we were all set in New England because we had lots and lots of gas plants. The thing is, the forecast did not consider the fact that those plants could not necessarily get natural gas. In years since then, there have been lots of meetings and discussion and actual work done on the idea that if you're a natural gas plant, where are you getting the gas all the time? Is your gas supply reliable?
Yeah. We saw that play out in Texas within ERCOT back in 2021 during Winter Storm Uri, where because of the way that they're set up, they weren't able to borrow from neighbors either.
Yes. They had two problems. The first is that they didn't want to put up with some of the things FERC does, so they had limited connections with neighbors. This was sort of Texas being the Lone Star state, okay? But they also had the problem that the neighbors were in the same shape they were. In my book, in Shorting the Grid extensively, is that our ISO New England is actually pretty careful about the customers, about the people who need power. And so ISO New England set up a system where they would pay to put oil on site at some of the gas plants. Now, many of the gas plants are what they call dual fuel. And as a matter of fact, I found when I was looking into New York lists plants as dual fuel or gas in their description. ISO New England doesn't do that, but many plants can use diesel or natural gas. So what they were doing, ISO New England said, okay, we'll give you some money for diesel. And if you actually end up using the diesel and getting paid by the grid operator for the electricity, then we won't give you that much money. But if you don't use it, you'll have it as a backup. And if you need to use it, it'll be there as a backup. And so that worked really well. I have several charts in Shorting the Grid about how the backup was working for that period of time. Well, the trouble is that FERC looked at this and said, you're the grid operator. You're supposed to be technology neutral. And so this business of paying for oil is not something we want you to do. I mean, we know you had to do it, but we don't want you to do it. So stop it, or stop it in 5 years or something like that. Anyway, so, there's all kinds of things like the grid operators thinking, well, I've got to make sure that the power lights stay on. And then FERC is thinking, I've got to be sure the grid operator is being fair to everybody. And then meanwhile, the person in home is maybe faced with a situation where they either can't get natural gas for heating or they can't get electricity. What fun.
Wow. Yeah. Well, so that seems like a step towards some reliability. Within the book, you also argue that particularly in deregulated power markets, they create some incentives that actually favor volatility over reliability. Can you talk about some of those mechanisms and
Oh, yes.
which ones are most problematic?
Oh, absolutely. You see, the thing is that let's say you're a power plant and you're on the grid. Do you like it when the grid is just going along smoothly and lots of power plants are available and they're meeting load? No,
Probably not going to get paid
because
too much.
because nobody's getting paid very much. The way you get paid is when things are getting bad. And so the power plants that are very expensive are being dispatched. So what happens is that the way the payments go on the grid is you pay according to the clearing price. So let's say I'm a power plant that can supply at 1 cent per kilowatt hour. There's another power plant that can supply at 2 cents, and there's a third that can supply at 3 cents. So the 1 cent one will be dispatched first. And if that's all there is, the clearing price is 1 cent per kilowatt hour. But if you need more, then you dispatch the 2 cent power plant. And now the clearing price is 2 cents. Now what that means is the 1 cent per kilowatt hour power plant is now getting 2 cents per kilowatt hour because it gets the clearing price. And as you can see, as the grid gets more constrained, then you dispatch the 3 cent one. And what I'm trying to say is the power plants are actually making their money when the grid is stressed. That's when the high price plants are being dispatched. Everybody's getting the high price. And so it's happy days. And, you can say, well, that's how a market's supposed to work. I don't think so. I mean, look, there are many ways markets work, but this particular thing is set up for power plants to really enjoy volatility. all the power plants enjoy the volatility.
And in your experience, Meredith, how is that influenced? Like, how would I perversely monetize that?
This becomes a matter of, accusation, but there are studies or articles that have said that one of the things that what went on in California at one point was that Enron decided that they didn't want to run they had unforeseen outages of their cheaper power plants. So that meant that the more expensive power plants were being dispatched, which meant the clearing price was going up. And so, to some extent, it was a win-win for Enron or for anyone who played this game, because they wouldn't have to supply. They would say, "Oh, we're having a big problem with the power plant," and so they wouldn't have to pay for gas for that power plant. But meanwhile, there are other power plants that they did have to pay gas for, perhaps. They were getting the highest price that they'd seen in months. It's a system set up for gaming. And the trouble is that it's sort of hard to prove, maybe the power plant was in trouble and it couldn't be online. Maybe 5 of them were in trouble and they couldn't be online. Maybe 7 of them were. You see what I'm trying to say?
And as we've seen greater penetration of renewables into the grid, Meredith, you talk about how that's distorted some of the price signals, and some of these baseload plants you've been talking about then start losing money, and it starts creating these strange dynamics in the market. Can you expand on that?
Well, yeah. One of the things is that renewables can often bid in negatively. That is, they can bid in and say, we'll pay you 2 cents, we'll pay you, grid operator, we'll pay you 2 cents per kilowatt if you take our power. Now you say, really? I mean, can you imagine going into a grocery store and they're going to tell you, we've got a lot of zucchini now, so instead of zucchini being 1 cent a zucchini, we'll pay you 2 cents to take a zucchini. This never happens. I mean, that just doesn't happen. But it happens in the power markets. The reason that the zucchini people can't promise to give zucchinis and give you 2 cents at the same time, and the power plant can, is that the renewable plants have funding that is not the funding from the market. And they don't get that much of that high a percentage of their payments as payment for kilowatt hour. I think I have a chapter in the book saying, depending on payment per kilowatt hour is a losing game for a power plant, even though that's what a power plant's supposed to do. But the renewables, you see, they have production tax credits and RECs. A production tax credit is basically, we think that you're a wonderful plant, you're a wind plant, just what we really like, and for every kilowatt hour you put on the grid, then we will pay you 2 cents extra. So that means that the plant operator was thinking, well, how can I be sure to get on the grid so I can get that 2 cents? Well, I'll bid in at minus 1 cent. And then no other kind of plant is going to bid in at minus 1 cent. I'm sure to get on. And then I'll get the 2 cents. And then once I'm on and getting the 2 cents, that'll just be great. Maybe there'll be other plants that aren't on and I'll actually get a clearing price too, Anyway, so it turns out that the subsidies really distort what plants get paid and how they get paid.
What would be your vision for how that would play out? Like, what is the ideal market dynamics as all of these competing technologies come into the grid, especially right now as we're seeing demand surge and the central grid trying to keep up? What would be an ideal model in your mind?
I think that's a very hard question, because you need to have oversight. And somehow or other people have the idea that markets will fix themselves because of the invisible hand or whatever, and so you don't need oversight. Oversight is command and control, and you don't want that. But really, a grid, it isn't a democracy. It has to have command and control. Can you imagine planning a highway system without people planning exactly where there's going to be on ramps and where there's going to be traffic lights and stuff? I mean, somebody has to think these things through. And if you think of the grid as an electricity highway system, somebody's got to think it through. Now, if you're looking at how could things be paid better, I think being paid for putting kilowatt hours on the grid and for a reliability in doing that. That is, if you've got a kilowatt hour now, you get some money. And if you can promise a kilowatt hour at midnight, you get some money whether or not you need to put it on. I think that would be it. You need to have some way of paying a plant for being reliable, for being available. There's something called capacity payments for being available, but if you go to my Substack, I really just jump all over capacity payments because they end up being something to play with for the different groups. You know, they're like, okay, do you get a capacity payment, for example, for energy efficiency? What? Well, of course, you have to have a payment for energy efficiency because then you don't have to actually put a power plant online. So what you're doing is you're doing a capacity payment for megawatts. And how do you track this? Oh, it's easy. No, it isn't easy. You know, I've got several blog posts called things like bye-bye to efficiency payments or, you know, things like that because, or it gets to be really complex, which of course I don't like because I'm trying to write about it and explain it and make sense of it. But the operators like because you can hide a lot of things in a thicket.
Yeah. Yeah. You're absolutely right. I mean, incredibly hard to track, and it also could create, you know, perverse behavior of people ramping up their consumption just to get a higher baseline, and then all of a sudden they're consuming less. So there's a lot of nuance there. Well, transitioning into maybe a simpler topic,
Thank you.
nuclear, something that you've been near and dear to you for a long time. I mean, you've been passionate throughout your career on nuclear. Given I think there needs to be an all hands on deck, all technologies type of approach right now as we're seeing demand ramp up. Really, what role do you see nuclear playing in the years to come, decades to come, in this energy transition, especially, you know, in light of, you know, many nuclear plants coming offline in the past several years? Where do you see nuclear sitting?
Well, I was on a podcast where the interviewer said to me, "So Meredith, if you had a magic wand, how would you change the grid?" And I said, I would wave my magic wand and all existing nuclear plants would stay online and be repaired to stay online. And they wouldn't go off for trivial reasons. And then we build some new ones. But the first thing I do with my magic wand is keep the existing nuclear plants online. What can I say about the role of nuclear? I almost wish I could do some diagrams, but let me imagine a diagram for a minute. What is demand on the grid? Demand usually is there all the time. There's always some electricity being used 24/7. And then in the morning, electricity use ramps up, and in the evening, it goes down. So you can imagine a very simplistic diagram, which consists of time across the bottom and electricity use up the vertical side. So there would be a box across the bottom that is at some level of electricity use that's always there. So that is the base load electricity. Then during the day, you can imagine a triangle or maybe a trapezoid or something, which goes up and then comes down. Okay. So when you get right down to it, if you begin looking at these things, because the baseline is there 24/7, it turns out Isarus and Sinervrata studied this in several states, that between 55 and 65% of electricity use is baseload. It is that box at the bottom. And so if you had, if you were concerned about CO2 emissions, if you had nuclear for all the baseload, then you would only have to be concerned with 30 to 40% of the energy being made as possible fossil fuels. So, and some of that could be solar, and some of that could be wind, and some of that could be fossil fuels. You would cut down your fossil fuels use hugely. But I guess that's what I feel, that the first, I would like it if we were like France, we had a lot of nuclear, but I think the first steps would be keep all the existing nuclear, build enough nuclear so that baseload is always nuclear, and then play around with the up and down part with nuclear. In France they do a lot more load following with nuclear than we do here. Natural gas, wind, and solar, because that's still only 30 to 40% of the 60% is being taken care of with no greenhouse gases because of nuclear.
Yeah.
As baseload.
Meredith, this is obviously a massive topic of conversation at a political and policy level right now. What do you think is most misunderstood by the policymakers when it comes to thinking about our future energy mix and the reliability of the grid and affordability of energy?
Oh, goodness. I think it's almost a spiritual problem where I really feel that one thing we have to do as people and as a country is look at reality and not just be, someday it's going to be great. This is going to come down the pike any moment now. We have to build on the basis of reality. And so I guess what I would think is that people should look at what types of energy are available now and build more of the reliable ones and build some of the experimental ones, but not assume that the experimental ones are just going to take over. Because if you really think about it, when I came to Vermont, which was 21 years ago, I met people who had lived without electricity because it hadn't been electrified, especially in the rural areas. So what you want to do is accept that things take time. I mean, by the time the rural areas of Vermont were getting electrified, New York City was the Great White Way. It was booming away with electricity, but Vermont wasn't. So you have to understand that this kind of infrastructure thing takes time, and you can't just say, oh, look, we're going to make hydrogen and that's going to do it. We don't have to worry about all this other stuff. No, you do have to worry about all this other stuff until hydrogen proves itself.
It is a lot. I think that's maybe a challenging thing within both political and corporate climates is the arguably decades long, multiple decades kind of long view that you have to take on these infrastructure versus a, quarter by quarter corporate cycle or a every 2 to 6 year political cycle.
Yes, I agree. And as I say, part of it is, making the numbers for the quarter. Part of it is getting elected next time. But I really think part of it is that people don't want to do the emotional work of looking at what reality is and what choices they actually have.
Yeah. Well, so on that note, if you were to give one piece of advice to policymakers that are, arguably have a rather tough job of balancing decarbonization, grid reliability, now a major growth in demand and consumption. What would your advice be to them? And do you have any examples, of regions or countries that are getting things right?
Well, Ontario's doing things right. Ontario has a mixture of nuclear and hydro, and they sort of phased out coal while nobody was looking. They didn't make a big announcement that they're going to phase out coal. They just kind of built nuclear and hydro, and they phased out coal. And what advice would I give? I mean, keep moving in the right direction and don't overpromise. I mean, that maybe they have to overpromise. I don't know. I've never been a politician. I've only been a writer and a chemist. So don't overpromise and move in the right direction.
Yeah, Meredith, this has been great. And I think it's very interesting, isn't it, reflecting on Dan and I are on the distributed energy side of the world and a lot of supporting businesses to think about how they control their own energy. But it's very interesting zooming out and seeing the complexities of the grid that I think energy has always showed up in this magical way. And we don't really often think about the complexity that sits behind it. And so it's been really interesting to get your insights. I think
Well, thank you.
we'd love to close out with our power surge round. And so if you could be any energy technology, what would it be and why?
If I could be if I became an energy technology, I would definitely want to be solar. And the reason is that short hours, high pay, and everybody loves you. What could be better?
So good. We've had many people say solar, not for those reasons, and I love that answer. I love that answer.
Oh, in other words, they go just for the everybody loves you part.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Well, you're extremely both, an accomplished writer, but also, I imagine in that whole process, extremely well read. Do you have any, recommended sources, books, podcasts, newsletters? I know you have your own Substack, The Electric Grandma. So I'll give a plug for you there. But outside of that, any other resources that you might recommend for our listeners?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that Robert Bryce and Irina Slav and the Energy Bad Boys on Substack are really worth following. Irina is based in Bulgaria, and she mostly covers Europe. But she is really worth following just because if you don't follow someone like Irina, then you're going to be blind to what else is going on in the world. On the other hand, for what's happening in this country, Energy Bad Boys is great, and Robert Bryce is a mixture in the sense that he has done many movies and videos as well as his books, which I really appreciate his book Power Hungry and his movies Juice. And anyway, how, as he says, how electricity explains the world. And I mean, I think Robert Bryce, maybe you should start with Robert Bryce and move on to Irina Slav and Energy Bad Boys. I don't know.
Wonderful. I haven't actually heard of the Energy Bad Boys, so I'm excited to check them out. The final question for you, Meredith. Could you finish this sentence? In my life, I will have been successful when?
I will have been successful when I feel I have done the things I was supposed to do in this world. I mean, that the kids are doing well, that the people are more knowledgeable about the reality of energy than before I came on the scene. I'm going to get back to what I said about why I became a chemist way back when. I became a chemist because, I I had an interest in science, but the physics majors all seem to be working on these huge problems and, just mind-boggling problems about the universe. And chemists seem to be able to make progress, little progress, and it adds up to really many, many aspects of our life being much better. So I guess the thing is that I would hope that I have made my life better for my family and made my life better for the world by helping people understand energy reality.
Lovely. Great way to finish. Thank you for sharing your amazing expertise. And I look forward to digging into your Substack as we continue to explore this topic. And I'd encourage everyone to check out your book and The Energy Grandma. Well,
yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith.
Thank you very much.
Dan, the Electric Grandma, very fascinating, very well spoken, very knowledgeable, really great discussion.
Yeah, the shared wisdom of years navigating this space was awesome to hear. I think for me, she opened with this, and this is stuck with me throughout, which is just helping people be grounded in reality and facts and kind of the way things actually work, versus I think there can be a lot of misnomers and hyperbole in the space. And I think bringing back to that education of here's how things work, here's why they work, here's the way that maybe they aren't working as effectively because of regulatory constructs. And I think it works, it holds true on a grid level and an independent system operator level. And it also holds true all the way down to an individual facility. I mean, I was just on with a business leader this morning that came off of the conversation clearly with a lot of great questions, but just like, help me understand this. And it's not necessarily something people have had to think too much about, because the powers arrived at a reasonable price, and it's just that was an almost a given. And now that's changing, and people are needing to level themselves up in their understanding of how it works, why it works, how they might be able to take more control over it. And it's great to have folks like Meredith trying to take extremely complex topics and distill them down into something that's digestible for the lay person. How about yourself, Gav?
Yeah, I think what resonates for me, Dan, is like consistently the technology exists. Like there's nothing that has to be groundbreaking here. She spoke about nuclear, gas, renewables, the grid itself. Like we've been doing that for a long time, and I think the tech exists, but it's policy, it's consistency, it's the commercial frameworks, it's the having the 3, 5, 10, 20 plus year plan, to your point, instead of like the quarterly goal and chipping away at like this is a long-term transformation. I think we're firm believers in the grid having multi technologies and having the ability to adapt and flex up and flex down. But I think it always keeps coming back to, doesn't it, is that the chances of us doing this in a really affordable, streamlined, sustainable way at a grid scale is becoming increasingly challenged. And it just keeps putting more and more emphasis on businesses thinking about how they need to control and own their own destiny, because the way we're currently approaching it, it's not going to be affordable, and the power is going to go off because of the fatal trifecta, which we've come to rely on. And so it is a super interesting topic, and I don't think we spend too much time talking about the macro grid level, but this was a really good reminder of how complex it all is.
Yeah, and it's all connected, and it all influences us as individuals, within our homes, as well as business leaders within our business, and even as companies deploy distributed energy systems, they're not going to go off grid.
No.
They're going to interact with the grid in a different, hopefully more profitable, cleaner way, but the grid's still going to be there, and it's still going to be a necessary component of the way that our societies are built.
Yeah, and if we do it right, we can actually benefit the grid, to Meredith's point of that baseload power, and, having to navigate the peak demand and the surges, that's the bit that we can really iron out, is making sure that people always know is my minimum expected backup needs, but I'll deal with all the other stuff that's going on.
Yeah, certainly. No, that was a really fun one.
Good one. Thanks, Dan.
See ya.
We receive a lot of questions from business leaders around the world wanting to learn more about the energy transition, what is possible, and where to start. So to help you stay informed and up to date on best practices, opportunities, risks, and success stories, we created an industry newsfeed at VECKTA.com/news with all our podcasts, blogs, and newsletter. Check it out and connect with Dan, myself, and the VECKTA team to learn more. Cheers and have a good one.